Ta-da! You know what this is? You know what this is right here? This is the reign of God. Reign, R-E-I-G-N, like kingdom, like this is what it looks like where God rules. This is the Yahweh administration, you could say. Okay, it's also me pouring water on a plant that I have precariously placed on top of our baptismal font. But this is also what the reign of God looks like. I know that may seem kind of anticlimactic. Watering a plant, he's watering a plant, that's what God's kingdom looks like? That seems somehow something of a disappointment. That seems something of a letdown. No fireworks, no big booming voice, nothing powerful or ominous. Watering a plant? Well, yes, and maybe there's more going on here than our eyes at first recognize. In fact, let me borrow the words of Rabbi Jesus first. These are the words that are at the heart of our gospel reading for this coming Sunday, the third Sunday after Pentecost. This comes from Mark, the 4th chapter, verses 26 through 34. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God," or my editorial note, the reign of God, "the reign of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow, he does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle because the harvest has come." He also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or the reign of God? Or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it's sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." With many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. Jesus seems to think that the reign of God looks something like, well, a bonsai tree on top of the baptismal font, maybe. There's more going on in what Jesus has to say than just a plant just sitting there. But Jesus is trying to get through to his hearers, to suggest an answer to what does it look like where God reigns? How does God rule the universe? How does God reign over all things? What does it look like where God is calling the shots? People who lived in Jesus' time, in the days of the Roman Empire, in the days of the reign of the Herods in Judea and in Samaria, they knew what other kinds of rulers' administration looked like. They knew that when a new Herod came to power, look out, a whole bunch of vanity projects were going to be built all over the place. They'd be building temples and buildings with his name and the Herod family name all over it in big old gold letters as a giant testament to the colossal size of Herod's ego and his insecurity. They knew that when Caesar reigned, wherever the empire of Rome reigned, you could expect violence and oppression as Roman soldiers marched through your cities and decided to make a public example of anybody who looked at them funny, who could compel you to do work for them or walk or carry their things for them. And to live under Caesar's reign or Herod's reign, people were clear about what it meant. You knew who was calling the shots, where Rome was. They would march banners through the streets announcing Rome forever. Herod would have his image or have his likeness or his name inscribed on all sorts of things as a way of showing he called the shots, that he was in charge. And people were hungering for something different than the colossal ego of Herod, or the brutality of Rome. And so Jesus comes along, having echoed first the message of John the Baptizer, saying, God's reign is at hand. You've heard of Caesar's reign. You've heard of Herod's kingdom. God has come now to reign and to rule over what is rightfully God's. And for any good, faithful Jewish listener, that's everything. Everything is God's. Oh, good, finally, at last, God's reign is coming. We've suffered under one empire after another, one puppet king after another. And they had lived under the reign of Herods and one after another, and Rome and Greece and Babylon and Assyria and a handful of others in between. They knew all of those empires. They knew what it looked like to watch their reign. They were marked with violence and brutality and smashing things to show who was boss. And everybody was aching for something better, something different. Finally, God's reign will come. And Jesus announces the first sentence we get on Jesus' lips in Mark's gospel is the good news of God. The reign of God has come near. Turn around and believe the good news. It's happening right here and now. And then people looked at Jesus. And they noticed that he wasn't commanding any armies. And they noticed that he wasn't smashing down any of the monuments that Herod had set up to his own ego. And they noticed that Jesus wasn't playing by their rules. And to be honest, some people were kind of disappointed. Rabbi, Jesus, no disrespect, was sort of the thinking, but you announced that God's reign, God is much more powerful than Caesar or Herod or anybody else, right? So how come you keep saying God's reign is breaking in, but it sure doesn't look like anything? It kind of looks, Jesus, if you're the one bringing the reign of God, it looks like you're a homeless, wandering religious teacher, and that you are wandering from town to town, curing a handful of people of sicknesses and teaching people along the way. No offense, Jesus, but that looks like kind of a letdown. And Jesus responds, sort of addressing, well, what is it, this reign of God that I've announced anyway? What is it to even say that God's reign has come near? How does God rule? What kind of a ruler, what kind of a king, what kind of a Lord is God? Is God just like a big version of King Herod? Is God just like a big version of Caesar Augustus? Is God's kingdom just the Roman Empire with a different name on the letterhead? And Jesus' answer is decidedly no. And Jesus sees that as good news. That God's way of ruling, God's way of reigning in the universe doesn't look like what the empire does. God does not have to march in an army or soldiers or build giant monuments with anybody's name inscribed in big gold letters. God's reign happens subtly, almost imperceptibly, beneath our radar, sometimes in ways our senses struggle to pick up. Jesus says the reign of God isn't like a new army marching into town, kicking out the old army. The reign of God is more like, well, it's like a farmer who scatters seed in the ground and it grows, but he doesn't know how it's happening. It's this thing that's happening, this very real thing when a seed sprouts and comes to life, but beyond the control of the farmer, to be sure, and in ways that the farmer can't quite see happening. Almost while you're looking the other way, there it is, almost like that old John Lennon line, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. The reign of God breaks out in ways you can't perceive while you're not watching, while your head is turned, while you're looking the other way. It's like watching seeds sprout slowly, something really happening, and happening with or without your permission, with or without your awareness, but it's happening slowly and gradually, and maybe in ways that at first you don't see what the payoff is. I mean, there's a lot of waiting, there's a lot of work a plant has to do to grow, germinating from a seed that looks dead in the ground to becoming, something that can produce a harvest. It's a lot of weeks of waiting and waiting and waiting to watch a seed become a stalk of grain, and then for that grain to be harvestable, and then finally to grind it into flour and make bread with it. That's a lot of waiting, and sometimes you have to say the plant's got to do what the plant's got to do to get to that point. The image Jesus uses later, comparing the reign of God to like a mustard seed. It's this thing that looks tiny, insignificant, and Jesus says, but you got to trust. It's doing something important. It grows from something very, very small, something that does not look very impressive at all, into this vast shrub, big enough that you can get birds making their nests in its shade. Echoing the image from the prophet Ezekiel, who imagined one day that God was going to cut off a sprout or a sprig from a cedar tree and plant it, and it would become big and tall, and that the birds of the air of every kind would find shade in its branches and shelter there in its leaves. Jesus says God's reign is something more like that. It's not something big and announced like a parade or a spectacle or a show of force. It's not like a military parade where you're marching through your weapons to intimidate. It's something that happens imperceptibly behind the scenes, and that its good, its value might not be reducible to a crop or a harvest that you can immediately see. Sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes the good that a plant does isn't about what cash value you can get out of it, but how it brings other things more fully to life. The mustard shrub Jesus is talking about isn't something someone's going to harvest. It was practically seen as a weed in the ancient world. But if you're the bird who gets to have shelter there because there's a shady shrub in a dry and arid place, that's good news. It means something good for you and for your brood. Jesus suggests God's reign happens below the radar, non-violently, without causing a ruckus or a show, but happens and erupts in little places that maybe go unnoticed, that maybe to other people look like a letdown because it's not a big show of force, because it's not like Caesar marching in his armies or Herod building a monument to his own ego, but it's something subtle behind the scenes. Jesus is okay. He's secure enough in himself that he doesn't need to be building monuments with his name or to be commanding armies with flashing weapons shining in the sunlight to intimidate his enemies. Jesus comes bringing life in little moments, in one-by-one interactions, right? It's the one-on-one healing, or we're feeding a small crowd of people, we're teaching a handful of people on a hillside. Those are small moments, but Jesus is convinced God's reign happens there, and something is really happening, even if you can't perceive it. Which is why it seems important on a day like today for me to set this right here, to set our little bonsai tree right here over the baptismal font, as a reminder that God's up to something, bringing life, bringing God's reign, even in things that look tiny or insignificant or like they're not even happening at all. Right now, in the course of this lived conversation, something is happening, and something that's for the good of the tree, but also for everybody else in the room. This tree right now, in our presence, is taking that water I poured and the carbon dioxide in the air and is cranking out oxygen for us to breathe in this space. Maybe not a lot, but some. It's contributing to life in the fullest. Not only for itself, it's growing, it's thriving. Even if I can't see the growth happening, it's growing. And it's making this room more hospitable for human beings who breathe the oxygen it gives off. Like the mustard seed in Jesus' parable. It grows even when you can't see it happening, even when you can't watch it moment by moment and go, there it is, I see it growing. It happens almost imperceptibly. But just because you can't see it, just because I can't see it, doesn't mean it ain't so. It means maybe I need to slow down and trust that life can be breaking out even when I don't see it happening, or I haven't given it permission to happen. God's reign happens below our radar, underneath our perception, and even without our permission. And that God's reign isn't just about propping up some institution for God's sake, but about doing something good for those beyond the boundaries. The mustard shrub creates shelter for the birds. The cedar tree, a sprig that Ezekiel imagined, was about creating shelter for other creatures, not the tree itself, but for birds that would find shelter. The reign of God isn't just about building an institution called church, but about bringing life more fully to anybody and everybody, outsiders who are aching to be welcomed in. And it's happening all the time. It is so easy sometimes to feel like nothing big is happening. It has felt an awful lot in the days of the pandemic, hasn't it? Like everything just got put on hold and life stopped and church stopped doing stuff. We all just sort of hunker down. It sure can feel like that. Maybe instead a seed has been germinating. Maybe instead God's been at work in ways that were behind the scenes, below the radar, but happening nonetheless. And we've been brought into that kind of reign. We have not been drafted into an army whose job is to intimidate and scare and terrorize other people like Rome's armies would. We have not been conscripted into a building crew to build giant edifices or monuments to glorify some petty ruler's ego like Herod would have done. We've been brought to be a part of the new thing God is doing in Jesus. And the way God's reign happens, the shape of God's kind of kingdom, the policies, you could say, of the Yahweh administration, are about bringing life even in moments and ways that nobody else can perceive at the time. You and I have been brought into that, which is why I've taken the bonsai tree and put it here over the waters of the baptismal font, to remind you and me on this day, and maybe for a while, as long as we need the reminder, that God's kingdom is happening, that God's growth is happening all the time, even when we're not paying attention, even when we don't see it happening. This tree is growing even when we can't see it, and you and I are part of a new thing God has done. In the waters of baptism, we're brought to life, and you and I are growing, and God's reign is growing, not just in numbers of people, but in the ways God's love is being formed in us, in the ways God's Spirit is moving us, prompting you or me to speak to somebody, to listen to somebody, to care for somebody, to serve somebody. That might not look impressive, but Jesus seems to be saying that you can't boil down the reign of God into statistics or shows or spectacles. The reign of God is this almost imperceptible sometimes reality. It's real even when you can't see it. And even if at first you were expecting a big spectacle and it turns out to be more like a plant growing when no one's watching, it's a blessed thing to get to be a part of. Come join us. This coming Sunday, join us in worship at Hope and at New Life on Sunday morning as we dig deeper into what it means to be a part of this reign of God and what are ways we can be a part of it in the week ahead. Come join us on all the adventures that God is up to among us and help us dream new ways for God's reign to take shape among us too. It may not get any headlines, but maybe that was never the point. Jesus seems to be okay with the idea that God's reign happens, even if nobody else recognizes it at the time. God's reign has always been meant to be an alternative to the violent spectacle of Rome and the showy ego-stroking of King Herod. The reign of God is the quiet, sustained, faithful love of a God who won't give up on the world, but insists on bringing it to life, even when it takes a while. Join us on Sunday.